In the silence of an autumn evening, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of the dojo, I never imagined that my life was about to take such a radical turn. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, and for more than 4 decades, I have dedicated every breath, every movement, and every thought to the art of Bushido, the way of the warrior. However, the experience I am about to share transcends any teachings I have received in my years of training, any wisdom I have accumulated in my travels, or any truths I thought I knew. As a martial arts teacher, I always prided myself on my unwavering discipline and dedication to technical perfection. My students looked to me as an example of control and serenity, a beacon of Eastern wisdom in an increasingly chaotic Western world. What they didn't know, what I myself refused to acknowledge, was the emptiness that gnawed at me, an abyss that no medal, no recognition, no achievement had been able to fill. My story began in the mountains of Kyoto, under the tutelage of my grandfather, a man who embodied severity and tradition in every gesture. From my earliest childhood, the sound of bamboo hitting would set the rhythm of my existence. The corrections were constant, relentless, but always precise. There was no room for error, no space for weakness. Perfection was not a goal, it was an obligation. I vividly remember those icy early mornings, when the dew still covered the tatami mats of the family dojo. My grandfather would wake me before dawn, and while other children were dreaming, I was already practicing kata, repeating movements until they became a natural extension of my being. Pain was a constant teacher, but so was silence. In those moments of absolute stillness, between movement and movement, the seed of something began to germinate that I would not understand until many years later. My youth was spent between the rigor of training and the solitude of discipline. While my contemporaries were discovering the modern world, I was immersing myself ever deeper in ancient traditions. Every victory in international competitions, every new dan I earned, every student who bowed before me in respect, was another step on a ladder that seemed to have no end. And yet, with each achievement, the emptiness inside me grew deeper, more unfathomable. The irony of my existence was not lost on me. The more I strove for external perfection, the further I drifted from my own command. The teachings of Bushido speak of honor, of loyalty, of courage. But where was the love? Where was the compassion? These questions tormented me on lonely nights, when the masks fell away and only the man in front of the mirror remained. The day that everything changed was seemingly like any other. I was in Berlin, taking part in a prestigious international martial arts event. The hall was packed with spectators, the air thick with anticipation. As always, my performance had to be flawless. The movements flowed with the precision of decades of practice. Every gesture calculated to the millimeter, every breath perfectly controlled. That's when it happened. In the middle of a particularly complex sequence, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the ordinary chill of exhaustion or physical exertion. It was something deeper, more primordial. The world around me began to blur, sounds receding as if I were diving into deep water. My legs, which had never failed me before, gave way beneath my weight. The last thing I remember from that moment was the dull sound of my body hitting the tatami, and then darkness. A darkness unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It wasn't the absence of light. It was the presence of something else, something that defied all human understanding. In that absolute emptiness, where time seemed to not exist, I began to perceive sensations that escaped any earthly description. The air, if it could be called that, was dense, almost tangible, charged with an energy that made each breath a conscious effort. Sounds came through distorted, like echoes of distant laments that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I was floating in that indefinite space, with no up or down, no past or future, when a figure began to materialize before me that I will never forget. It was not a sudden apparition, but rather as if the darkness itself condensed, gradually taking shape until it revealed a face that humanity had learned to associate with absolute evil: Adolf Hitler. But this was not the Hitler of historical documentaries or black-and-white photographs. He was not the proud, megalomaniacal dictator who had plunged the world into chaos. The figure before me was a distorted shadow of that man, a version twisted by the weight of his own actions. His posture, once upright and commanding, was now hunched as if he carried an invisible weight. His eyes, which in historical images had shone with fanatical determination, were now sunken, consumed by indescribable pain. Before I could process what was happening, his voice echoed through the void. It wasn't the authoritative tone of his speeches, but a hoarse whisper, laden with an anguish that transcended the barriers of language. "You want to know how I got here?" he began, his words seeming to carry the weight of decades of torment. "It wasn't because of the choices I made. It wasn't because of the orders I gave. It was because of the emptiness I allowed to grow inside me, a void I tried to fill with power, with hate, with the illusion of grandeur." His words struck me with physical force. I recognized in them an echo of my own quest for perfection, of my own inner emptiness. Hitler continued, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. "The real hell is not this place. It is not the flames and the torments. The real hell is seeing with perfect clarity what we might have been, what we destroy in ourselves in our quest for power." He told me how every act of cruelty, every decision made out of hate, had not only destroyed millions of lives, but had eroded his own humanity. Every time I chose power over compassion, hate over understanding, I built this place inside. Hell is not a destination. It is a choice we make with every action, with every thought. As he spoke, the space around us seemed to pulse with a somber energy, as if responding to his words. I saw fleeting images of lives destroyed, of dreams cut short, of human potential wasted. But what was most disturbing were not the images of physical destruction, but the small, seemingly insignificant moments when a kind word was not spoken, when compassion was suppressed in favor of pride. "The real tragedy," Hitler continued, "was not only the horror I unleashed on the world, but the love I never allowed into my heart. Every act of cruelty began as a small act of denial of love, of the humanity we all share. And now, in this eternity of consciousness, I see with perfect clarity every moment when I could have chosen differently." His words resonated with a truth that transcended his own story. They spoke to me of my own quest for perfection, of how in my dedication to martial art, I had often forgotten compassion, forgiveness, human connection. How many times had I confused discipline with toughness, excellence with inflexibility? As I pondered this, other figures began to materialize in the darkness. I recognized great spiritual leaders who had fallen into the trap of ego, legendary warriors who had allowed their quest for glory to overshadow their humanity. Each had their own story of how power, pride, or ambition had led them away from their true nature. Among these figures, one particularly struck me, my own grandfather. I saw him not as the stern teacher I had known, but as a man consumed by his own demons, by his inability to show love. "I taught you the way," he told me, his voice heavy with regret, "but I forgot to teach you the heart. I showed you how to be strong, but not how to be passionate. I taught you how to fight, but not how to forgive." Every confession, every story I heard in that place was like a mirror reflecting aspects of my own life. I saw how my quest for technical perfection had created a barrier between my heart and the world. How my pride in my accomplishments had fueled an ego that kept me from true wisdom. In that moment of absolute clarity, I understood that hell was not a place of external punishment, but the natural result of our own choices, of our turning away from love and compassion. Every act of harshness, every moment of hubris, every denial of our shared humanity builds that space of loneliness and torment within ourselves. The revelation was interrupted by a tugging sensation, as if something was pulling me toward the surface of a deep ocean. Sounds began to change, figures faded, and gradually, I became aware of more mundane sounds. The beeping of medical machines, worried voices, the movement of medical personnel. I woke up in a hospital bed in Berlin. Doctors explained that I had suffered cardiac arrest during my demonstration. Technically, I had been dead for several minutes before they managed to revive me. But what they saw as a medical crisis, I knew had been much more. It had been a journey to the very heart of the human condition. The next few days in the hospital were a period of deep reflection. Every moment of my past life was presented in a new light. I saw how my quest for technical perfection had been, in many ways, a way of avoiding facing my own humanity, my own imperfections, my own needs for connection and love. During my recovery, I began to read texts I had previously ignored. Not only ancient martial arts treatises, but also spiritual writings from various traditions. One day, in a small hospital chapel, I came across a verse that resonated deeply within me. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet loses his soul? These words seem to perfectly sum up the lesson I had received in my near-death experience. All the technique, all the discipline, all the achievements in the world meant nothing if we lost our connection to humanity, to love, to compassion. My return to the dojo a few weeks later marked the beginning of a new stage in my life and in my teaching. The classes began to change. While technique was still important, it was no longer the absolute focus. I began to talk to my students about the balance between strength and compassion, between discipline and forgiveness, between technical excellence and the wisdom of the heart. I introduced moments of reflection in the classes, spaces for students to connect with their emotions, their fears, their hopes. I taught them that true strength is not in the ability to defeat others, but in the ability to defeat oneself, to overcome the pride, fear, and hatred that separate us from our true nature. The results were amazing, not only in terms of technical development, which remained excellent, but in the personal growth of my students. I saw how people who came looking only for physical skill began to discover a deeper dimension in their practice. I saw how compassion and understanding began to flourish instead of competitiveness and ego. One of the most important lessons I began to share was about the nature of true power. I explained to them that real power comes not from the ability to dominate others or to achieve external perfection, but from the ability to maintain our humanity in all circumstances. I told them how every little decision, every moment of choosing between harshness and compassion, between pride and humility, builds our character and determines our destiny. I also began to speak openly about my own experience, about my journey to hell, and what I had learned there. Although some skeptics might dismiss my experience as a hallucination caused by the lack of oxygen during my cardiac arrest, the principles and truths I had discovered resonated deeply with those willing to listen. My encounter with Hitler and the other tormented souls became a powerful metaphor for teaching about the consequences of our choices. I explained to them how every act of cruelty, every moment of hubris, every denial of our shared humanity builds an inner prison from which it becomes increasingly difficult to escape. But I also taught them about the power of forgiveness and redemption. I explained that it is never too late to change direction, to choose love over fear, compassion over power, connection over isolation. I showed them how every small act of kindness, every moment of true human connection, brings us closer to our true nature. Over time, my dojo became more than just a physical training center. It transformed into a sanctuary where people could find not only physical development, but also spiritual and emotional growth. Walls that had once only witnessed combat and kata were now witness to profound personal transformations. I began to see remarkable changes in my older students. Those who had come years ago seeking only physical power now displayed a depth of character that filled me with pride. I watched as they passed on these teachings to new students, creating a chain of wisdom that extended beyond martial techniques. One day, while observing an advanced class, I found myself reflecting on how my near-death experience had changed not only my perspective on martial arts, but on life itself. I recalled Hitler's tormented words, not with horror, but with a deep understanding of how each of us carries within us the capacity for both light and darkness. This realization led me to develop a new aspect in my teaching. understanding our own shadow. I began to talk to my students about how each of us has dark aspects that we must recognize and confront. I explained to them that true strength is not in denying these parts of ourselves, but in recognizing and transforming them. I implemented new exercises that combined physical practice with deep introspection. For example, during sparring sessions, I asked my students to identify not only their opponent's technical weaknesses, but also their own emotional reactions: anger at a defeat, excessive pride in victory, fear of failure. This new methodology was not received without skepticism. Some older students, accustomed to the traditional approach, found it difficult to adapt to these new dimensions of practice. Some even left the dojo, arguing that we had strayed too far from martial traditions. However, for every student who left, two new ones arrived, attracted by the promise of training that nourished both body and soul. As the months went by, I began documenting my experiences and teachings. What started as simple notes for my classes turned into an extensive manuscript exploring the intersection between martial arts, spirituality, and personal development. I wrote about my experience in hell, but not as a horror story, but rather as a parable about the importance of maintaining our humanity in all circumstances. The manuscript addressed themes I had never seen discussed before in traditional martial arts literature. It spoke of the need to balance discipline with compassion, technique with wisdom of the heart, tradition with personal evolution. Each chapter began with a traditional technical lesson, but then delved deeper into its spiritual and emotional implications. One particularly significant chapter was about what I called the compassionate warrior. In it, I explained how true strength comes not from the ability to cause harm, but from the ability to protect and nurture. I used examples from my own experience, including how my encounter with Hitler had shown me that power without compassion only leads to destruction, both of the outer world and the inner world. Word of this new approach to teaching martial arts began to spread beyond the walls of my dojo. I received invitations to give seminars in other countries, not only at martial RTS schools, but also at personal and spiritual development centers. At first, I was reluctant to accept these invitations, fearing that the message would be diluted or misinterpreted outside the context of the dojo. However, I soon realized that these opportunities were a way to bring the message of transformation to a wider audience. I began traveling, sharing my story and teachings with people from different cultures and traditions. I was surprised to discover how universal the message was. The search for balance between strength and compassion, between discipline and love, resonated with people of all backgrounds. During these travels, I met other teachers and professors who had arrived at similar conclusions through different paths. Some had had their own near-death experiences. Others had arrived at these truths through years of practice and reflection. Each encounter enriched my understanding and added new dimensions to my teaching. One particularly meaningful encounter was with a former Buddhist monk who was now working as a counselor at a rehabilitation center for war veterans. He had been working with people who, like Hitler in my vision, had allowed violence and power to take them away from their humanity. His job was to help them reconnect with their innate compassion, to find their way back to their true nature. This encounter led me to expand my work beyond the traditional dojo. I began offering special programs for people who had experienced trauma or violence in their lives. Using a combination of physical practices, meditation, and emotional work, I helped these people reconnect with their humanity, to find strength not in hardness, but in vulnerability and openness. Working with these groups was particularly challenging and rewarding. I saw how people who had been trapped in cycles of violence and trauma began to awaken to new possibilities. I saw how martial arts practice, when taught with a focus on compassion and awareness, could become a powerful tool for healing and transformation. One of the most impactful stories was that of a former military man who had served in multiple conflict zones. He came to my dojo looking for a way to manage his anger and trauma. At first, he was resistant to anything other than pure physical training. Gradually, however, as he began to engage in mindfulness practices and emotional connection exercises, he experienced a profound transformation. One day, after a particularly intense session, he confessed to me that he had been contemplating suicide before finding the dojo. The combination of physical discipline and emotional labor had given him a new perspective on his experience. For the first time, he told me, "I feel like I can use my strength to create rather than destroy." These experiences led me to develop a more structured program that combined traditional martial arts teachings with principles of modern psychology and spiritual wisdom. The program was based on the premise that true strength comes from the integration of all aspects of our being: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. The program was divided into several levels, each focusing on different aspects of personal development. The first level focused on establishing a solid foundation of physical technique and mental discipline. The second level introduced mindfulness practices and emotional work. The higher levels delved deeper into spiritual development and the integration of all these aspects into everyday life. A crucial component of the program was what I called shadow practice. Inspired by my experience in hell, this work involved helping students recognize and transform their own dark aspects. I taught them that these aspects were not to be denied or suppressed, but rather recognized and transformed through awareness and compassion. As the program developed, I began to see interesting patterns in the way people responded to the work. Some experienced initial resistance to the emotional work, others found the physical discipline challenging. Over time, however, most began to appreciate how each aspect of the training complemented and reinforced the others. A particularly rewarding aspect of this work was seeing how it began to affect not only individuals, but also their relationships and communities. Students reported improvements in their family relationships, greater effectiveness in their jobs, and an overall sense of greater purpose and meaning in their lives. I also began to see the work extend beyond the dojo. Students began to apply the principles they were learning in their own areas of influence. Teachers brought aspects of the program into their classrooms. Executives implemented mindfulness practices in their workplaces. Therapists incorporated elements of physical work into their sessions with clients. As the program grew and evolved, I began training instructors who could take this work to other communities. The training process was rigorous, requiring not only technical mastery, but also a deep commitment to personal development and spiritual transformation. Training instructors became one of the most rewarding aspects of my work. Seeing how others took these teachings and adapted them to their own cultural and social context showed me how the universal truths I had discovered in my near-death experience could manifest in different ways in different contexts. Reflecting on all this years later, I realized that my encounter with Hitler in hell was just the beginning of a much longer journey. What began as a traumatic personal experience was transformed into a catalyst for positive change in the lives of many people. The most profound lesson I learned and continue to share is that true hell is not an external place, but a state of disconnection from our own community. And true heaven is not a distant destination, but a state of full integration and expression of our full communication. Every day in the dojo is an opportunity to remember and live these truths. Every student who walks through our doors is a reminder of the innate human capacity for transformation and growth. And every practice, every moment of connection, every small step forward is an affirmation that the path of the true warrior is the path of the heart. As I grow older, my understanding of these truths continues to deepen. I see how every aspect of my life, even the darkest and most challenging times, have contributed to this understanding. And while I know my time on this earth is limited, I am confident that the seeds we have planted will continue to grow and bear fruit long after I am gone. My experience in hell showed me the end result of a life lived without love and compassion. But more importantly, it showed me that there is always a way back to our true nature. This is the message I continue to share, that no matter how far we have strayed, there is always the possibility of awakening to a truer, more meaningful way of being.